This is a presentation of the 19th Annual Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop, a program of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, Friends of CAIC, and the National Avalanche Center, presented by Dynafit and Pomoka.
Welcome to my presentation titled On the Stability Interpretation of Extended Column Test Results. I'm going to present you findings which are based on data from Europe and North America. Quite a few colleagues helped me with this study. These were in Switzerland Kurt Winkler, Matthias Walcher, Alec van Herwijnen, and Jörg Schweitzer. In the US, Karl Birkeland, Doug Chabot, Jim Earle, and Ron Zimmenhuis. And in Spain, Ivan Moner. The extended column test was introduced about 14 years ago in New Zealand and the US, and since then it's probably become the most widely used stability test which we are using in the field today. To perform an ECT, a column of snow is isolated from the surrounding snowpack, and we then load the column of snow by tapping on the back of a shovel blade. We then observe whether a fracture occurs in the column of snow and whether this fracture travels all the way across the entire column. To see this in the field, we can look at this very short video which my colleagues in Spain made. So here they've got this column of snow isolated from the surrounding snowpack, and then they load this column by tapping on the back of a shovel blade. Here at the 14th tap, the entire column collapses and a failure occurred quite low down in the snowpack. The question now is, if we do observe some kind of ECT result, what does it mean in terms of stability? And here the most widely used interpretation scheme is probably the one developed by Ron Zimmenhuis and Karl Birkeland in 2009. They proposed that a full propagation, as we see in the right-hand picture, is normally associated with unstable conditions. If a fracture occurs but does not propagate, or no fracture occurs at all, then it's considered stable. In Switzerland, Kurt Winkler and Jörg Schweitzer also did a study using ECTs and trying to come up with a stability interpretation scheme, and their finding ended up with a three-class scheme. Full propagation, which with less than 21 taps is considered unstable. Full propagation with more than 21 taps required to cause this propagation is considered something like an intermediate class, and no propagation or no failure would be considered stable. So the question we are asking here now is the observation of a certain ECT result rather an indication of instability or stability? And what we are trying to answer with this question is whether we can tune one of these stability classification schemes, maybe now that we have a lot more data than in 2009. We explored three databases, one from Switzerland, one from Spain, and the SnowPilot database, which contains profiles from all over the world, although in the end we ended up using profiles mostly from the US. From those databases, we extracted snow pits which contained at least one ECT and which also had some kind of information relating to snow stability, which allowed us to rate the slope the test was performed on as stable or unstable. To do this slope stability rating, we went through the information provided with the profile, and we considered an ECT location or ECT slope as unstable if signs of instability were observed or recent avalanche activity had occurred in the slope where the test was carried out or in a neighboring slope. We rated these locations as stable if neither signs of instability nor recent avalanche activity was mentioned, and they were neither in this tested slope nor in its surroundings. For the snow pilot data, we additionally used information describing whether the slope had been skied or snowmobiled, or whether there were tracks on the slope to decide whether the slope was stable or not. If part of this information was missing, or it wasn't clear in which category we could assign a location, we didn't use this ECT. And this meant that from the more than 30,000 snow pits which are stored in these databases, we ended up using 4,000. Of those, about 1/3 were considered as being in an unstable slope and 2/3 in a stable slope. What you can see here on the right is that most of the data we are now actually analyzing comes from the SnowPilot database, and about 200 also from Spain. So what did we find? Let us first look at the fracture propagation by itself, regardless of how many number of taps we had to do until a fracture occurred. If an ECTP was observed, this was in 50% of the time on slopes rated unstable. This compares to ECTN or ECTX, which were only on 20% of the time observed on slopes rated unstable. So quite clearly, we do have a difference between ECTP and ECTN in terms of their correlation with slope stability. This finding matches very well with what Karl Birkeland and Ron Simonis showed in 2009. Now, let us now consider fracture propagation and the number of taps until failure together. For this, we went stepwise. If there was more than one ECT failure in the same test, as is shown there on the right-hand side in the picture, we considered as most relevant the test result which resulted in an ECTP. If there were several in the same snow pit, then the one with the lowest number of taps, and otherwise we used ECTN or ECTX. We can now plot all the combinations of the number of taps required to initiate a fracture, and in a plot like this, and here you see quite a few points, and the way you can read these points is, for instance, if we look at ECTP 11, ECTP 11, about 68% of those were observed on slopes rated unstable. And in this plot, the red triangles refer to ECTPs, the orange dots to ECTNs, and the green square there on the right to ECTX. Furthermore, I plotted a solid and a dashed line, which is representing the mean of 5 or the mean of 7 number of taps combined to facilitate the analysis a little bit. There's another very important line in this graph, and that is, in our data set, we had 33% of the locations which were unstable, and this is our base rate, which we compare all our findings to. If we now look at this graph, we see, firstly, that regardless of the number of taps required to initiate a fracture, we do see that the proportion unstable is much higher for ECTPs compared to ECTN or ECTX. What we also see is that with an increasing number of taps required to initiate a fracture, the proportion unstable decreases. So in summary, we can summarize these two findings that both whether a test shows full propagation or not, as also the number of taps do correlate with slope stability. So now we actually want to know which of these combinations of ECT, fracture propagation, and the number of taps does provide us an indication on stability or instability. And for this, we compared our values which we had with our base rate. So the way you can understand it is if our red line, for instance, is clearly above our base rate, then this is normally associated with instability. If our line is below our base rate, clearly below, then this is associated with stability more often. If we now do this analysis, we come up with the following. ECTP with less than 22 tabs, they were clearly on the more unstable side of our base rate. In contrast, ECTN with more than 8 tabs or ECTX, they were clearly much lower than our base rate, and we can interpret them as rather stable. And what we can now see is that there are some ECT result combinations which are sort of in the middle and which are actually very close to our base rate. And this is ECTP more than 22 tabs required, or ECTN less than 8. And those are sort of a mixed bag of unstable and stable, as sort of a class in between. From this, we can now propose a new interpretation scheme for ECT results. And we try to keep it simple, and we suggest 3 classes. For ECT results, we suggest should be considered when an ECT propagates and the fracture initiates with low to moderate number of tabs. A fair test result would then be an ECTP with a high number of tabs, or a non-propagating ECT with a low number of tabs. And finally, ECTs interpreted as good stability would be ECTNs in the moderate to high number of tab range, or ECTX. So what you can take home from this short presentation is a couple of things. Firstly, the ECT clearly is a valuable test for stability assessment. What is important is that the most relevant piece of information which we can extract from an ECT result is the fracture propagation. This sort of decides primarily whether the test is related to stability or instability, which is close to the proposed interpretation by Ron Simmenhuis and Karl Birkeland. However, we have also seen that the number of tabs required to initiate a fracture is also relevant and can help us find sort of an intermediate score. What we didn't look at in this presentation or in our study is how does a test location or a test result compare actually to slopes which we are interested in. And this, of course, is a major challenge in whatever we do out there, because spatial variability is so high. Furthermore, there are clearly false alarms or misses when we do perform a test. And this means that we should never rely only on a stability test for our assessment, but we should include all other pieces of information, observations which we make during the day. So as a very short conclusion, I would suggest if we do observe a poor test result, that should be an indication that extra caution is necessary when we travel in similar slopes in avalanche terrain. If you like more information, please do read our short article in the Avalanche Review. This article will be published this October in this October's issue. If you are interested in more of a scientific background and also a comparison, for instance, between ECT and the ridge block test, or a comparison between ECT results and the forecast danger level in the region, or whether it might make sense to perform a second ECT in the same snow pit, then please refer to the second publication, which I've shown here on the screen. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully what I have presented is useful for you when you're in the field this coming winter. Thank you.